Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself. On this episode, I'm joined by Arthur Snell, former British diplomat and an expert in geopolitics, and crucially for this conversation, climate change. Arthur, welcome to the show.
Terry, thank you for having me.
No problem. I've probably done you a disservice in that very brief description. Maybe you could just give us a bit more of the background to your career, I suppose, in terms of where what you've covered up to now and how you've kind of ended up writing about climate change. I know you've got a really interesting story at the start of your book, which we're going to come to talk to, but maybe you can just give us a little bit of your background, and for those who aren't aware of you and don't know you, it'll be really useful.
Sure. So I joined the Foreign Office in the late 1990s, as they were showing my age there. And of course, that was a very different world, a world pre-9/11, post-Cold War, arguably a time where we were in a relative period of stability and peace worldwide. But clearly the events of 9/11 happened quite soon into my career, and that certainly had an impact on my working life in government service. So I worked in places that were very affected by the war on terror, places like Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan. And then a bit later on, I was a British High Commissioner, which some listeners will know is the sort of alternative title for ambassador in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And I guess both working in the Caribbean, but also actually during those postings more associated with the war on terror, I became increasingly aware that the issues in front of our eyes, issues to do with conflict, radicalization, extremism, were sometimes masking much more fundamental issues, and in particular, the shifting climate. And I guess that's something that was sort of working away at the back of my mind. I left government service about 10 years ago, 2015 roughly, and since then I've worked as a consultant advisor on geopolitics, but I've also started to build up a bit of a parallel career as a writer. And in particular, this idea of climate change, but how it interacts with geopolitics is something that fascinated me. I think a lot of people, when they talk about the climate, we think about ecology, maybe we think about certain species of animal going extinct or certain ecosystems coming under threat. But we don't always think of it in the context of global power and how it's impacting global power. So that's something I focused on, and it's the subject of a book that I wrote called Elemental, The New Geography of Climate Change and How We Survive It. And that came out in March this year.
That's great. I mean, that's a brilliant way of introducing the book and the topics that we want to discuss. Because as you said, I think when people do think about climate change, they think about the environment and the impacts it maybe has on them directly. You know, we talk about maybe in certain cases where there may be natural disasters occurring with more frequency and more potency, and how that might affect different parts of the world. It feels relatively short term, but then at the same time we hear, the IPCC reports where we're talking about temperature rise and what might happen in the future. And in some ways it feels that we flip from thinking about climate change at a very localized level to a very global level, but at quite a distance, and in things that, always seem much further down the line. Is your sense from what you've picked up, and not just in your research, but in your lived experience, that actually these things are much more immediate and not just local to us, but things happening elsewhere have an effect on all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an element of this that is really interesting and important is the way in which we as humans are very bad really at sort of making wider connections. So, we see something in front of our face and we ascribe it immediately to the things that are around us. And whilst that sounds a bit unsophisticated and simplistic, I think that still applies even the way, for example, that governments deal with crises, or the way that maybe military and intelligence organizations analyze certain situations. So coming back to this issue of the climate, perhaps to illustrate this, an anecdote from fairly early on in my career. I worked in North Nigeria, and obviously the north of Nigeria and the Sahel region is one that has seen a lot of instability and conflict over the years. And I think if you ask people to talk about what are the causes of that, they would talk about maybe tribal differences, maybe radicalization and extremism, maybe poor governance, corruption, things like that. These are all basically things that are right in front of our eyes that we can very easily examine. But what not many people are talking about is the fact that over decades and with an increasing rapidity, the climate in that region is shifting in ways that basically make it harder for people to live there. And so what that is doing is having a whole lot of impacts, one of which is forcing people into smaller areas of land, which of course then increases tensions, disputes over land rights and farming versus people who graze their cattle and those sorts of things. But of course, it's also just putting bigger economic pressures on millions of people. And of course, finally, there are ways in which the climate is impacting the way that outsiders react to that region of the world. The Sahel is rich in critical minerals, for example. So then outsiders are coming to that part of the world in order to extract lithium or uranium or whatever. So that's just an example of how we wouldn't say necessarily that the climate is the cause or the sole cause of what's happened in the Sahel region. But if we take it out of the equation, we're missing something really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting way of framing it. And I think what's also interesting in your book, you sort of lay out those immutable facts at the start to sort of say this is what's happening in terms of temperature rise, what we're seeing, in terms of the numbers. But you also mentioned that from a geopolitical perspective, and I wonder if that this is partly to do with that gap in people's perception, that there are people who almost sort of refuse to accept that climate change is this massive issue that we've got to do something about. There are those people who deny, that it's a real thing, and it's not just ordinary people; it's people who are world leaders, and so in part of that may be down to how they perceive this issue affecting them, but also kind of this scramble for resources as well that's going on.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there. I mean, coming back to a point that you made actually in your first question, Terry, there is this thing that if we think about our own lived experience, particularly if you live in a place with a relatively moderate climate, Northern Europe, maybe North America, most of the time, you don't see the climate as a crisis. I mean, we do get heat waves, we do get extreme weather events, but they're quite unusual. And so one might say, well, there's always been hot summers. We all remember 1976, or, we don't remember it, but we were told about it by our parents or whatever. So it's easy to sort of use those kind of slightly unscientific measures. And so in a way, I think for politicians in particular, there is this kind of thing where, to some extent, if your country isn't directly impacted in a crisis way, as opposed to a longer term shifting way, it's if you choose to, you can say, well, are we really sure about this? The world's temperature has fluctuated over millennia. We get hot periods and colder periods. Are we really sure it's caused by human activity? And certainly from, what my research showed me is that North America is actually unique in this perspective. I mean, particularly the United States of America, that's where you have a fairly mainstream position, tends to be almost all Republican politicians. I'm not being politically partisan here. I'm just observing what is happening, that will say that the climate crisis either isn't happening at all, or if it is happening, it's nothing to do with human activity. Now, for me, that there may be an interesting discussion to be had about the sort of underlying scientific causes and whether or not that there's some validity in those questions. But we have to accept that almost all climate scientists everywhere are in absolute agreement about the causes of the climate crisis, which is basically increasing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And anybody who wants to look at how much CO2 is in the atmosphere can look at a graph where you see it does fluctuate over millennia, and then the graph basically turns into a vertical line, and that's the bit that we're living in. And you don't have to be a great scientist to understand that this is something that has never happened in the history of our planet, or certainly not in the history of humans living on this planet. And therefore, it would be quite bizarre if this had no impact whatsoever. But going back to then, so why is it then that some politicians are choosing to push back against this? I think a lot is to do with economic motives, and a lot is also to do with the nature of the climate crisis, because we can all agree, perhaps, that there is an unprecedented amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, that greenhouse gases are at the highest level in recorded history. But we can't see it. I can't look out of the window and see how many parts per million of CO2 there are in the atmosphere. So I'm already dependent on scientists, on experts, on remote people to mediate this thing to me, that as an individual. And of course, we live in an age where, for lots of reasons, people are a little bit suspicious of experts. They're suspicious of people who seem to be coming from some kind of elite, telling ordinary people how they should change their way of life. Maybe they need to, fly less often, change the car they drive, eat less meat. There's somebody giving you a lecture about all the ways in which your life is going to become slightly less fun, or slightly more expensive, or slightly, less convenient. And you can see how, if you are a politician, particularly a populist politician, someone whose political style is kind of telling people, well, I'm on the side of the ordinary guy and not the elites and the experts who are ruining your life. You can see how that pushing back against the climate crisis is a very attractive political positioning. And so it's quite interesting that when you look at populist politicians all over the world, there's a big overlap in that Venn diagram between populist politicians and politicians who either are climate deniers or at least climate skeptics. And I think if you think about that, in a way, it's not surprising, because there is this issue where for sort of ordinary people who perhaps feel somehow disconnected from governments and experts and scientists, you can see how it's, for a populist, you can sort of play into that sense of disconnect.
And I think you've hit on a really key point there, isn't it? In that it's that difference between having to give people a hard message to say, this is really serious. We're going to have to change fundamentally how we live and how we operate as a global society.
Yeah.
Versus, there's a fire a few doors down, but don't worry about it. It's not real. You can just carry on doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's easier for people to deliver that message that it's okay. It's not real. You can carry on living how you are. Lifestyles don't need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the issue is, there's another element of this, which again, Terry, obviously, I know you work in the defence world. It's quite hard for governments to deliver a message that actually all of us need to accept that we're living in an unsafe world, and that's going to be very expensive for us to deal with. And maybe there's a realignment of, global defence relationships. So perhaps we're going to be much less reliant on the US. So therefore, as the UK, just for, take one country as an example, or Europe more broadly, we all have to pay more tax because we've got to pay for more military. Now, governments know this, but it doesn't mean that they're very keen to tell anyone this. And I think we're living in that sort of a situation similarly with the climate crisis. It's always very tempting for a government to say, well, yes, it's very difficult and the climate is a huge challenge, but actually it's not going to cost you anything. So don't worry, And the thing is that, as ever, the answer is somewhere in the middle. That there are people who have a reason. It may be that they're on the sort of radical environmentalist end, or actually the radical climate denial end. They have a reason to tell you it's going to be a lot worse than you think it is. And of course, there are people who are basically misleading you and saying, no, it's not going to cost you anything. It's all going to be fine. And as ever, the truth is somewhere in the middle, that, yeah, there will be changes. They might be expensive. But, just for example, that even at that classic sort of low level situation of improving the insulation in your home and switching to a air source heat pump versus a gas heating. It's the kind of thing that, yes, it's a lot of money up front. And of course, lots of people don't have that money, but you can see that over years, you'll probably make savings. So, I mean, that's a very domestic case study, but it's a case of where there are definitely costs, but they may not be long-term costs, and you may over time actually save money.
So, picking up on a couple of things that you mentioned there, Arthur, and I've got a couple of directions I kind of want to take this in, but we'll maybe do one first and then the other. But you mentioned in the book that there's obviously all these actions that individuals are trying to take or can take to mitigate our own impacts and reduce sort of our carbon footprints, etc. But at the broader global scale level, it's going to take governments and much bigger action to actually reduce the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening? I mean, how optimistic are you? I know we've continually missed targets and things like this that have been set, and I think the COP summits seem, from my perspective, to have been gradually becoming less effective, if they ever were. So, we're seeing countries withdrawing from agreements, etc. So, yeah, how optimistic are you that governments are moving in the right direction on climate change as a whole?
Yeah, it's a really big and fundamental question. And I think you're absolutely right that if we look at the COP summits, in particular, Conference of Parties, I'm sure lots of listeners are familiar with those, we're kind of used to seeing a big report, all the world leaders got together, and then the COP failed to reach an agreement. And that's almost, you can write the headline before they've even finished. COP fails to reach agreement is almost the standard headline.
Yep.
Yeah. But I think, and of course that's true, that is the case. And in particular, in more recent years, you've got major countries not even really participating, particularly the US, to some extent Brazil as well. So there are lots of issues there. Having said that, the first thing I think we have to note is that, yes, it's true that the best solution to climate change might have been the countries coming together in a kind of genuine sort of United Nations, all holding hands. We make a binding agreement over, 25 years to gradually shift to a net zero world, and we all breathe a sigh of relief. Now, that has not happened, and I think we've got to be realistic. That is not going to happen. And that means then that the target of 1.5 degrees of limiting global heat change to 1.5 degrees Celsius is also not going to be kept to. So there are lots of issues there. But I think the first thing to note is that the COP summits almost always agree something. And of course, it's much less interesting to dig into the weeds of exactly what's been agreed. But for example, mechanisms for putting a price on carbon so that you can then obviously you can do carbon offsetting. That's a really important element of the transition to a net zero world. Another thing that COP summits have successfully done is brought countries together that have a higher ambition. And obviously, if 5 really small countries got together and said we're all going to go net zero in the next 5 years, it's irrelevant. I mean, no disrespect to those countries, but clearly that's not going to sort of budge the needle. But actually, if a collection of fairly significant countries that collectively are responsible for a fairly significant amount of the world's emissions get together and agree those targets, then that starts to have an impact. And it has an impact in two ways. One is obviously just the absolute emissions that are being reduced, but also obviously that it provides a kind of example, and perhaps not the least of which, it demonstrates possibly that you can reduce emissions and still have a growing economy. And I think we should come back to that because that's an interesting point.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
But I think to go back to your question, countries haven't achieved this, and that means we're not going to meet the 1.5 degree target. And that means we're going to live in a changed world. And in a way, that's part of the point of my book is, my book isn't a sort of campaign book. It's a book trying to help people understand the future that we're going to be living in. And it's a future in which, the fact is we haven't met the targets, and therefore some things will change in quite dramatic ways. And again, this isn't a doomsday scenario. It doesn't mean the end of humanity and, the cockroaches take over. But it does mean that there will be places that people probably won't be able to live anymore. Or it does mean that some countries, very low-lying countries, will lose some or almost all of their territory. So we then have to start thinking about, well, what does that mean for the wider world? And in a way, that's sort of the aim of my book, to try to translate the reality into what a likely future holds.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And in the book, you've broken it down into four elements: earth, air, water, fire.
Yeah.
And through that structure, you've kind of gone through various case studies and examples of what it means in different parts of the world. And I kind of want to come on to where you've highlighted areas that the effects of climate change will drive more conflict, and relating it back to, as you mentioned, I'm working in defence, and it's interesting to see that relationship between climate change, geopolitics, and conflict that we've already seen and observed in places, and how that's probably going. We expect it to be a bigger driver of conflict and instability, etc. So, you mentioned also net zero, and we're in the UK at a point in time where we're coming up to midsummer, but we're also waiting for the government to really give us clear strategic direction on what they're going to do in defence.
Yeah.
And there's talk of potentially sacrificing that net zero target in order to fund defence. And it strikes me that the two things shouldn't necessarily be traded off against each other. But it'd be great to get, from you some of your thoughts around that relationship between climate change, defence, and instability and the drivers of conflict that we may see in the coming years.
Yeah. Well, it's a massive question, but I mean, I guess if I went just back to the Sahel region, which I mentioned before. So if you look at a map of Africa, and obviously the Sahel is a region to the south of the Sahara Desert, and you draw a straight line from the Atlantic Ocean across to the Red Sea through the Sahel, every single country on that line experienced some kind of military coup or sort of violent breakdown of government in a short period in recent years. So now we could say, oh, well, that's just a coincidence. I don't think it is. No. Well, what we're looking at is the impact of climate on the wider set of factors that I mentioned earlier, tribal differences, economic challenges, and all the rest of it. And that's just one example. And of course, then that has loads of knock-on effects. It drives people migrating out of that region. It draws in other countries. Let's think at the war in Sudan, which has drawn in Arab Gulf countries. So there are all kinds of knock-on effects. The Russian mercenary group Wagner, now rebranded as Africa Corps, has been drawn into the Sahel again. So the way that conflicts create ripples that escalate out. But another case study is the Arab Spring. Again, it would be incorrect to say that the Arab Spring was caused by climate change as a single entity. But if we think of climate change like a catalyst, and obviously everyone will remember from their science lessons that a catalyst is something that makes a chemical reaction more intense, and whilst not actually sort of being part of that reaction. If you think of climate in that way, then you can sort of apply that to various conflicts. So in the case of the Arab Spring, the original kind of uprising in Tunisia, which is where, of course, it all began, it stemmed from, one young man who was a market trader being, being mistreated by the police. Eventually, he set himself on fire and died. And he was struggling to make a living in an area of central Tunisia that had been strongly impacted by climate change, falling yields for farmers in that region, a lot of economic challenges. Now, obviously, that wasn't the only factor. You had corruption, you had an oppressive government, you had police brutality. But again, if we look at Syria, where, of course, the Arab Spring metastasized into this lengthy civil war, there were areas, particularly around Aleppo, where over years, people had been leaving rural areas because of the shifting climate, making it very hard for them to make a living in their kind of traditional way in farming, and coming into the cities. And then that puts pressure, increases social pressures in city environments. And then you combine that with the fact of it being a oppressive government, corrupted, very brutal, and that's a kind of spark that ignites. So we can see the role of climate in conflict in lots of those settings. But I would argue you can even see it in the conflicts that are unfolding right now in the Gulf, when we talk about the war with Iran and the US and Israel and so on. Now, it's a less direct link, but at the moment, in a way, there's a massive choice that governments have to make about whether or not they are for the energy transition or, if you like, backing the sort of hydrocarbon option. And I think, basically, if you look at the two great powers in the world today, the United States and China, it's rather interesting. They've both basically chosen a different path. So the US has chosen hydrocarbons to back oil and gas, that a form of energy that the US itself has dominated and does dominate. And in a way, the US's power of the last century is very bound up with its power over the hydrocarbon sector. Now, China has backed the energy transition. Now, that's not to say that China doesn't use hydrocarbons. After all, it's still using coal, an even older form of fossil fuel.
It's a big importer of oil still, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the difference is that China is accelerating that shift, and in fact its emission outputs are falling even as its economy is expanding, and that's really interesting. So it's proving this point that you can expand your economy whilst dropping your emissions. And of course, China is absolutely dominating the technologies of the energy transition, whether it's EVs, battery technologies, you name it. And so,
yeah, I mean, just on that, I think I'm really glad you mentioned China, because I was going to ask your thoughts on China, because they have seemed to capitalize on this and have really got ahead of everybody. Is that in part because are they more conscious of the direct impacts of climate change, or is it just because it's purely this is a massive economic opportunity and we've got to pursue it because this is where growth is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think they are very conscious of the real world impacts of climate change, and not least because of the impact. Some of the heaviest impacts, if we're looking around the world, fall on China itself. And actually, people don't talk about that very much, because we talk a lot about how well China is doing in its response in developing new technologies and all the rest of it, but we don't actually often reflect on the fact that, for example, the North China plain, that the area kind of close to Beijing, 100 million people live in an area that by all analysis is going to become very, very hard to live in. By the end of this century. So this is more than just a question of has China sort of, is there something that they're being more intelligent or whatever? They're looking at actually how do people carry on living in this place when obviously it's a country with a huge population. And I suppose particularly one of the advantage that China has it's not a democracy, it's a one-party state, that allows them to be able to make long-term plans in a way that is not as easy for a democratic country, albeit I think we could have a debate about whether democratic countries could do a better job anyway. But putting that to one side, that means that China can look into the future, can analyze very likely things coming down the track, basically, and then make decisions about what it wants to do about them. And those decisions might include, radically re-engineering its own economy because it foresees a lot of risk. And of course, one thing that Chinese leaders hate is instability. So anything that they think brings them instability, they're quite likely to respond to.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I wonder if from a national security perspective, it plays a part in their thinking. And I've got in mind a few years back now. I mean, this is prior to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think even prior to the pandemic, I was talking to somebody at the sort of most senior level in the UK in terms of national security, and I asked him the question, what keeps you awake at night? And without pausing at all, his immediate response was climate change. And, connecting that to security, I think, is something that isn't necessarily being done in the public discussions and debates that we have around climate change. And so I wonder if that is happening elsewhere in places like China. But I also wonder if it's that kind of thinking has maybe taken a back seat as well with the events we've had over the last 4 years since Russia has invaded Ukraine, and now we have the war in the Middle East. Is that something you're conscious of? And so, is that something that came up in the research you were doing as you wrote the book as well? That connection between, or that clear connection in terms of the discussions around climate change to national security and what it means for security.
Definitely, and I think it goes to your earlier point about whether whether a government might decide, for example, to drop one target in order to allocate more money to defence, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that in a way, what's interesting is if you talk to people, and I know, Terry, you and I probably have similar conversations, people who are in the national security space, whether we're talking senior military, officials, intel people, that sort of thing, almost everybody is of one view that, climate change is a national security threat. And as I think, this discussion probably shows, you can't disaggregate the elements of how the climate intensifies and catalyzes conflict and other security threats from the wider picture of what's happening in the world at the moment. And we've touched on Iran, but Ukraine's another case study where Putin had many reasons to invade Ukraine in his mindset. Obviously, I think he was wrong on every one of them, just to be clear. But he doesn't like the idea that Ukraine might join the EU or become closer to Western Europe in its sort of alignment. But certainly one of the things that drove him was an interest in critical minerals that exist in Ukraine. Ukraine's quite sort of gifted with its mineral resources. But another issue that Putin himself wrote about this, was Ukraine's prime agricultural land. And again, one of the elements of the climate crisis is the way that agriculture generally is becoming slightly less productive. So even at the highest level of, very high-tech agribusiness, you're getting slightly less good returns on your yields for crops and so on. So you can see how I doubt Putin was thinking in climate terms, but you can see how the climate has impacted Putin's behavior, even if he may not realize that. So there's no debate about this this overlap between the climate crisis and the wider security picture. The challenge is that certainly our current government here in the UK, and I think a lot of governments, really struggle to kind of do the joined up thinking, because obviously one of the responses that you would arguably make to a climate breakdown, climate crisis, would be to increase your overseas aid money to places that are most heavily affected, where obviously the outcome might be disorder, increased emigration, increased conflict, and all the rest of it. And the difficulty is that we're also robbing our aid budget to pay for our military budget, a policy that most senior military officers don't agree with. So, this isn't about some kind of tree hugger, we need to spend more on aid or whatever. This is ruthless pragmatism.
Oh, yeah.
But unfortunately,
we saw the same in the US. I mean, when they cut aid budgets as well, and it really affected a lot of international security related projects.
Totally. And I think, what's interesting about this is that we are, often the kind of the superficial level public debate doesn't really get to the heart of these questions. So people are going on about, oh, should we be giving money away to corrupt rulers in, I don't know, Africa or something? And actually, that's really not scratching the surface of the real impacts of these things. And of course, we've already seen USAID has largely ceased to exist as an aid organization. And the impacts of that have already been felt and have been seen. And of course, some of those impacts will be conflict and, increased conflict, increased disorder, aside from obviously the human cost as well. So I think that you can't disaggregate these two issues. Obviously, I don't have an answer in terms of the famous magic money tree, but I think that the government, the idea that somehow that dealing with the climate is a sort of luxury that you do if you're feeling flush is probably a kind of misunderstanding of the realities of this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just, the thought popped into my head that for a long time in the UK we've had a Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, but it makes me wonder if actually it ought to be the Department of the Environment, Food and Global Affairs, because
I mean, certainly one of the things that I was really struck by is actually food is a really interesting part of this story, because this point about the world food system is quite a sort of finely balanced. It's quite a finely balanced machine, we might say. The way that we get food to our supermarket shelves, with just-in-time delivery and all the rest of it. And of course, we've all lived through COVID, so we know what it's like. We know how easily this thing can be disrupted. And we are now living through a disruption. The closure of the Straits of Hormuz has affected world supplies of fertilizer. That will have an impact down the line. And the climate is definitely having an impact on agricultural yields around the world, both in our own country and further afield. So one of the people I spoke to for the book is somebody who operates a major agribusiness that operates across several countries. So they've got a really kind of broad perspective. And they say, they're definitely seeing falling yields, and in some places it's more intense than others. So for example, Brazil is a really tricky one. But there are then lots of unintended or unexpected consequences from this. So for example, China, very, very reliant on imports of soybeans from Brazil, and particularly because China's main meat that is eaten there is pork, and there are hundreds of millions of pigs that are fed with Brazilian soybeans, and actually those dependencies are things that then militate against taking highly risky choices, like invading Taiwan. So there are interesting ways in which actually the climate crisis increases some of the risk factors, but it actually then makes governments, in some cases, less likely to do something that they might otherwise have done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, definitely when you talk about food, and you mentioned Ukraine and Russia, and one of the issues that we've seen them tracked over the past few years has been the sort of theft of grain from Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so you see how big a deal that was, both for the Ukrainians, obviously, but also for the Russians to be able to take that resource.
Yeah.
Other than sort of food potentially being a big driver of insecurity, are there other specific areas where you think we need to be keeping an eye on, because that could be the next sort of tinderbox? And I know you mentioned in the book the difficulty of making predictions about what all of this could lead to, but are there other sort of key areas where you think there's some critical dependencies here that if something goes wrong, it could lead to conflict, or it's going to lead to a major breakdown in the way that we're interacting globally?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there are a few of these which are kind of major risk factors, and one of them is clearly water. So obviously, we can't live without water, but water is also in some respects very dangerous. It can be very destructive if you're talking about extreme weather events, flooding, but also rising sea levels. So I think there are two ways in which water in the climate crisis present risks. One is very simply access to freshwater supplies. And so there are lots of countries that rely on shared river basins. Of course, living on an island in the UK, we're very lucky that we don't have that risk. But India, Pakistan is probably the most significant example where you've got, way more than a billion people reliant on a set of shared river basins. And actually, if you include China in that, you've got a significant proportion of the world's population effectively sharing the fresh water that flows out of the Tibetan Plateau, out of the Himalayas. Now, interestingly, although India and Pakistan over years have, as everyone knows, have gone to war several times, they've actually managed not to go to war over water. So they've had wars over lots of other things, but they haven't had a water war.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a treaty which has stayed in place pretty firmly, which kind of governs that shared water resource. But we should never assume that these things are set in stone, and that's definitely a potential flashpoint. But then equally or additionally, the flashpoint between India and China. Again, China is showing some interest in building large dams up in Tibet on rivers that flow eventually into the Indian subcontinent. Now that could be an existential threat to hundreds of millions of people. And of course, sometimes when a threat is that significant, sometimes actually that drives countries to sort of put down their tools and talk to one another. But sometimes, of course, leaders miscalculate. So you could easily have a situation where the risk to a water supply is seen as such a significant one that it leads quite directly to conflict. But then just on the water thing, the other one is if we think about rising ocean levels, I think that could lead to conflict in a slightly different way, that people are just being displaced. So in certain parts of the world, people living in coastal areas are clearly at great risk. And there are some countries, particularly Bangladesh, where there isn't really much high ground. It's not that you just move in a few miles and you're okay. And so for those sorts of countries, what that means is inevitably migration in quite significant numbers. And that can be a driver of conflict simply because of the displacement effect, the sort of dislodging of certain communities, the fact that they then struggle to integrate in some new environment. So I think, water is a significant flashpoint.
Yeah, it's one that's often referenced. Even when we talk about Egypt and Sudan, for example, and the flow of the Nile. But yeah, you'd hope that, as you said, when it becomes such an existential threat for people, that actually it's a driver of cooperation rather than conflict. Do you, just sort of looking forward, we've touched on sort of China capitalizing on some of the opportunities that are arising from, say, the energy transition. If we were to sort of think about it from a more optimistic perspective, what other kind of opportunities do you think countries should be focusing on, whether they are or not at the moment, but that could help get us beyond some of the issues and challenges that are arising from climate change?
Yeah, I'm glad you've asked that. I mean, I think one thing to say is that there are no technological barriers to basically shifting to a net zero world. That we don't need to invent some magical new technology. It all exists for now. And just talk about sort of slightly more optimistic points. Let's just talk about renewable energy, some of the most basic types, such as wind and solar. Until fairly recently, you kind of had to subsidize or otherwise it was very expensive. And so it was, skeptics would say, well, it's not really an economically viable model. It's just a kind of activity that people are doing to sort of make an environmental point. No longer the case. It is now the case that probably the cheapest way to generate electricity is either through solar PV or wind power, and that's an extraordinary shift. That we used to think of this as a slightly fringe activity. It is now the cheapest way to generate electricity. No, another point is questions of scale. So quite often people say, well, okay, fine, solar energy is all very well, but you're going to have to cover the whole country in solar panels to be able to power the country. Well, we take the United States. If you put a square of land, which is 100 miles on each side, and you plastered that with solar panels, that's enough to power the entire country. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do that because it doesn't make sense to have it all in one place for all kinds of reasons. But just as a case study, now the United States is an immense country. There are bits of Texas and Arizona and Utah where there's nothing there, So this is, again, like I'm saying, I'm not saying you would then do that, but in terms of just the practicalities of it, there is plenty for us to be optimistic about. And similarly, some of this optimism is about opportunities for countries that have arguably not yet benefited from the kind of technological revolution. So across North Africa, you've got countries that have two advantages. One is they've got a climate advantage, that they're very hot and very sunny, and they're perfect, particularly for solar energy, but also wind energy, in particular on the Atlantic coast, so for Morocco, for example. The other advantage they've got is they're very close to Europe, which is a big market for energy. Now, we used to think of hydrocarbons as an energy you can export easily, barrels of oil, liquefied natural gas and so on. But with modern technologies, you can export electricity over long distances. It used to be that you lost all that power in transit. It's no longer the case. So actually, there's a future in which Europe is running off clean energy, much of it supplied from North Africa, providing wealth and revenue for those countries in North Africa, but also actually locking us into a kind of productive economic model where we have a mutual interest in stability and and close relationships with our neighbors. So that I think there are plenty of things to be optimistic about, but to some extent it requires a little bit of vision. It requires us to sort of lift our heads above the parapet and think, okay, I've got to think past the next 6 months to the next 6, 12, 18 years.
Yeah, and I think that's a really fascinating way to look at it, in that there is a path to technology helping us solve some of these issues. And I know sometimes, especially when you talk to people in the tech industry generally, there's a lot of over-optimism, and there's a lot of people who think that a simple thing is going to change the world and perhaps isn't going to. It's great to think that there are some solutions out there that could eventually come to play a much bigger role than they currently are, and certainly as they become more affordable and more effective. How much though of that is going to need sort of international cooperation? I mean, we touched on COP earlier and things like that, but if the US decides to go do a complete about turn and actually say, yep, we're going to go completely the other way on the energy, full on the energy transition, it would still need other countries to come along with them. I guess if you were able to get all of the G20 leaders in a room and give them some advice, what would you tell them?
Yeah, well, I think obviously if there was a willingness, particularly on the part of the US, clearly, it's such an important, powerful country, to take a leadership role, that would be brilliant. But I think we also need to be realistic that doesn't look very likely to happen. And actually, in a way, perhaps what we shouldn't do is wait for that to happen, because I think sometimes there's a degree to which we sort of say, well, and if they don't do it, there's no point us doing it, and it's almost an excuse for inactivity. So I think one of the things we're seeing at the moment is that obviously in an ideal world, you would have a world in which the most powerful countries, particularly the US and China, worked together, but also then created a kind of norm that they said, this is what needs to happen. And then everyone else would fall into line because they didn't really have any choice. But that would actually be a good thing. And collectively, we would move very quickly to some quite radical, reshaping of our world system. But actually, even if that doesn't happen, my argument and my sort of, if I can say, optimistic argument is that maybe it doesn't matter. And I'll explain why. Because actually, if you reach a stage, for example, where the cheapest way to supply energy is via renewable energy as opposed to via coal-fired energy or oil and gas, then actually what's going to happen is that increasingly that switch is going to be made, and particularly, and this is where it's important, for countries that have yet to sort of get to full capacity. So what I'm talking about is, for example, if you look at a Google Maps imagery of, let's say, a big South Asian city, somewhere like Karachi, what you will see is that an amazing number of private houses, of normal homes not in just very normal parts of the city, not where the rich live, now have solar panels on the roof. And that will be in an environment where a few years ago, nobody could have afforded solar panels, and people were probably reliant on a very unreliable and expensive energy grid, the national grid of Pakistan in this case study. So what's happening there is that we're seeing this energy transition happening because ordinary private citizens in places like India, Pakistan, parts of Africa are basically doing their own personal transition to net zero simply because it's the cheapest and easiest way of having reliable energy. And so I guess to go back to your question, Terry, yes, if I could get everyone in a room, I'd say, look, guys, you do this, you'll save money, you'll reduce conflict, it will be better for everyone. But if for whatever reason we can't actually persuade the world leaders to take what should be a fairly simple decision because of vested interests, because of political culture, because of a whole variety of factors, there's a slightly less good but still workable option, which is that the world just does this anyway because it's quicker and cheaper. And I think we're getting close to that point. And I see that as quite a sort of optimistic future that is in front of us.
I mean, yeah, it's a great example, and it's interesting you mentioned that. I actually had a power cut at home last week for about 15 hours, and it occurred to me that I could probably do with a solar panel and a generator.
Yeah, there you go.
But yeah,
solar panel and a bit of battery storage, and that's something that why not? Now that it's really cheap to do, and like I say, we're lucky that most of the time we have reliable power, and power cuts are relatively unusual, and they're normally quite short. Or clearly not in your case, but yeah, there are parts of the world. I've lived in Nigeria where the official grid power is pretty hopeless, and lots of people it's just sort of don't bother with it, and so actually when you take control yourself with your own power generation that is reliable, it may not be 24/7, but you control it. This is the energy transition happening not because of some international agreement or UN mission. It's happening because actually people are taking control and into their own hands.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I know we're sort of coming up towards the end of our conversation here, but I had, I suppose, one more question for you, which is something that I don't think you had the opportunity to cover in the book. But with the development we've seen in AI tools over the last 12 or 18 months, there comes with it the massive scale data centers that are going to be required to run these tools. And you prompted me to think of this when you mentioned covering a certain proportion of the US with solar panels, but actually the footprint of these data centers is going to be massive. And we've seen the plans for some of them that are currently being, scoped out and prepared to be built. They are way bigger and far, more power hungry than any of the data centers that have come before to power other parts of our online existence. So, just I guess a final question, really. What are your thoughts on how the role that might play and in driving up energy demand and how we cope with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and certainly we can't ignore it. And of course, the rapidity of the change is so extraordinary, isn't it? That literally 12 months ago, that was a different question to where we are now. So I think I suppose I've got a couple of thoughts on this. One is that we don't yet know kind of what the real demand is versus the kind of rather expansive boom that's underway at the moment. And I suppose what I'm getting at there is that, you know, there are a lot of there's a lot of AI usage which appears to have no real kind of economic value or real rationale behind it. So that's not me saying, oh well, you know, AI is useless. It's clearly it's going to transform a lot of parts of our society. But I guess there's a question around exactly how much of this is going to be needed when people are really paying for it rather than just using it to create sort of online videos and all that kind of stuff. But still, it's clearly a major shift and one that we can't ignore. So then what does that mean in terms of energy need? I mean, I think what I'd go back to is that at the end of the day, we have reached a stage where some of the cheapest forms of energy generation are renewable energy. So if you're trying to expand the grid, it'd be very odd to start building oil or coal-fired power stations when you can do this more cheaply by increasing wind and solar, just for example. So it seems to me that yes, we may end up needing even more electricity than we ever imagined, taking into account things like EVs and all the rest of it. Yes, so that is a higher overall gigawatt demand, but it's still likely that the main way you do that is through proven technologies which have been demonstrated to work, which are renewable clean energy supplies. And I guess in a way that perhaps one of the major questions that we don't really know the answer to yet is the degree to which, again, countries that have a real natural advantage in renewable energy. I mean, I mentioned North Africa earlier, but we're seeing it interestingly, or the Gulf countries are obviously very reliant on their own oil and gas industries, but they're ideally suited to many renewable energies, and they're installing quickly. That this is something that they're really putting a lot of effort into at the moment. So are we, for example, going to see Saudi Arabia in the future being the place that has all the data centers because it's just got immense amounts of solar energy that it can then apply to this purpose. So I think there are questions of that nature which we don't yet know the answer to. But I suppose I would finish by saying I don't think there's a fundamental difference in terms of how we generate energy and how that then powers the needs that we have for it.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering if at some point in the future we reach a point where we're asking the AI tools how to help us
absolutely
deal with the climate crisis. And
and clearly,
I don't think they're going to recommend turning themselves off.
Well, they're not, but clearly, AI. One of its potentialities is to drive extraordinary efficiencies in the management of complex energy grids. I would imagine, and I'm not an AI scientist by any means, so I'm very ready to be corrected. But I would imagine that this is the sort of thing that we could see a bit of a game changer in some of these spaces, because actually it's an ability to analyze incredibly complex data feeds, millions of data inputs, and maximize efficiencies. That might be that AI makes a real difference in that context.
Yeah, that's probably a really intriguing thought for us to end on. But before we finish, Arthur, I just wanted to point people in the direction of your book Elemental, which is out now available in bookshops. I highly recommend. It's fascinating reading it. And not least because I think you've given quite a few of your sort of personal stories of what you've seen and experienced. And I won't give anything away, but certainly from your time climbing mountains, particularly where you've seen some of this firsthand. And so I'd recommend to people to go and check that out. And
thank you.
Also want to point people in the direction of your podcast, Behind the Lines.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just mention a little bit about that, because we've not touched on that today.
No. Yeah. So I've had basically a geopolitics podcast. I do a weekly episode. It's normally a long form interview with some kind of an expert. We normally tackle some burning issue, whether it's something that's in the news as it happens. Most recently, I've just done an episode on the situation with Iran and the US, or some longer term situation that perhaps has had less attention. I've done episodes on Myanmar and bits of the world that are being a bit ignored. The war in Sudan is another case study. So it's Behind the Lines in all the places that you can get your podcasts.
Great stuff. Well, thanks for joining us, Arthur. It's been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation. There's plenty more to discuss on this, I'm sure.
There definitely is, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. So, Terry, thank you for having me.
The phrase that Arthur mentioned that sticks with me is ruthless pragmatism. And that's something I don't think we're going to see from our politicians, but perhaps we need to see it from society. He talked about the development of technology and how actually people are taking solutions into their own hands to deal with the impacts of climate change, for example, using solar energy. And that's something that maybe we're going to see more of, as maybe people will start doing things for themselves, especially as the technology becomes more affordable, more widely available, and more effective. Because ultimately, I don't think we're going to see politicians delivering difficult messages that are required to deal with climate change. We might see more conflict, but hopefully, as we talked about, we'll see more cooperation, especially around some of the serious issues that face us globally and can only really be dealt with through international cooperation. Some of these factors may drive some of that pragmatism, and maybe some of the impacts of technology also leaving me feeling not quite as pessimistic as I thought I might be after discussing some of the heavier and more serious aspects of this issue in terms of what may happen next and the sort of doomsday scenarios we keep hearing about, which may or may not come to pass. But ultimately it feels like it's our choice in some ways. We can see this situation developing. The signals are there. We know it's coming collectively. Perhaps we can do something about it before it's too late.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.